One of the very few names I knew from Japanese animation before watching any was Hayao Miyazaki. His films are as widespread and well known as the medium itself. A rather elusive and confusing man with an extremely interesting, unique story behind his life. I'd like to take this video to look through his career and see how he helped shape anime into the medium we know and love today. So sit back and enjoy as I take you through the story of Hayao Miyazaki. To understand the career and impact of Miyazaki, we need to follow his life, to see what influenced his work and what made him so unique, starting at the very beginning with his birth in 1941, growing up in a post-war environment that would become the basis for many of his future stories. The Wind Rises in 2013 being an almost direct reflection of this period of his life. Not only did the general era of post-war Japan influence him, but his specific life at the time. For example, his father worked for the Miyazaki family business, a factory that produced parts for aircrafts. This no doubt fueled Miyazaki's lifelong fascination with air travel, a reoccurring theme in every stage of his career. It played a huge part in early movies such as Nausicaa and Laputa, and remains prevalent to his most recent The Wind Rises. Even small details such as his closeness with his siblings or his mother's illness become huge signatures of his stories. Miyazaki's early life seeps through every narrative he tells throughout his career. It's the first step in understanding him as a practitioner. And this post-war era also perfectly lines up with the rise of comics and animation in Japan. Miyazaki grew up as legends such as Osamu Tezuka were revolutionising their medium, and he enters his working career just as anime is becoming a commercial industry. Miyazaki has cited many of the comics from the 40s and the 50s as influences on his initial creativity. Similarly with the first wave of colour anime films in the 50s such as Hakujeiden. This all lines up perfectly for Miyazaki as he finishes university at a time where the anime industry was young and prosperous, ready for new talent to guide its direction. His first foray into the industry was at Toei Animation, a hugely important step in his career for many reasons. Here he took immediate role in a management position and met Isao Takahata, whom he would continue to work with till the present day. But Miyazaki's time at Toei was brief, and after he and Takahata finished The Adventure of Halls in 1968, they became annoyed at Toei's corporate attitude, forcing commerce in front of creativity. As well as this, Miyazaki was disinterested by the industry's narrative limitations. He wanted to stray away from just rewriting old stories and using boring character types. Both Miyazaki and Takahata made a bold decision to leave Toei, and after a stint at A-Pro Studios, the pair joined Nippon Animation. This period of Miyazaki's career would be his most beneficial yet, progressing his craft and earning himself larger roles. He worked on a number of World Masterpiece Theatre series, some of my personal favourites from the decade. These series would each run for a year and would favour attention to detail and intricate storytelling. Miyazaki and Takahata clearly thrived here and many of their best attributes blossomed. The idea of subtly mixing fantasy and reality is a common theme in their later works. Their work on World Masterpiece Theatre really showcased how great a storytelling tool this could be. His years working on TV anime developed his talents, and in 1979 Miyazaki took the director role for the first time with The Castle of Cagliostro. This is where he belonged and where his skills were most effective, the director's seat. The movie was a small production with a budget that would be dwarfed by future Miyazaki projects, but it didn't stop him in injecting every scene with beautiful attention to detail and revolutionary animation. This is one of the biggest leaps I've ever seen a director take. It might not have been where Miyazaki wanted it to be narrative-wise, but visually it was amazing, and is still rightfully regarded as one of the best from its time. From now on out, there was no stopping Miyazaki's obsessive creativity. In 1984, Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind was created, an adaptation of Miyazaki's own manga that he was working on at the same time. And the leap I talked about with his TV work to Cagliostro is only surpassed by the leap from Cagliostro to Nausicaa. The film was once again revolutionary in its visual achievements, showcasing mind-bending animation and breathtaking compositions. It's easy to overlook Nausicaa's technical achievements, as the introduction of CG about a decade later would offer an easier way to show off multi-layered compositions. But Miyazaki didn't have this at his disposal, and he created unimaginably complex three-dimensional scenes using purely 2D animation. even scouting young talents such as Hideaki Anno to help with more complicated scenes. The movie's ambition was borderline psychotic, a huge production to be taken on by a fairly young team, but the risk paid off and Miyazaki and his team achieved something that had scarcely been achieved in the medium before, making an artistic leap that still baffles me today. This becomes the springboard for his next venture, Studio Ghibli. Miyazaki was pushing the medium with every project he was taking on, and Studio Ghibli was his biggest yet. It was set up to differ from the more commercial establishments that Miyazaki and Takahata had grown to dislike. They enforced a no quality drop policy. The projects would be ruthlessly worked on so that the team could push themselves as far as possible. To work at Ghibli was to dedicate your life for the duration of the production. The studio was founded on the back of Nausicaa's success, not only its commercial success, but the success of that specific team and Miyazaki's working style. This gave Ghibli the breathing room to be different. Miyazaki then headed the studio's first production, Laputa, Castle in the Sky, a very similar production to Nausicaa with almost all of the same staff returning, and a very similar visual style. You can see here as well Miyazaki's distinct storytelling style starting to cement. Aspects like strong female leads and trademark themes that I'll touch on later in the video. Laputa then went on to share a similar success to Nausicaa, and the risk that was Studio Ghibli had paid off considerably. This was where Miyazaki's impact begins to show. He strayed completely from traditional anime production practices, creating his own machine. And to not only be able to finish now 2 major movies, but to have them be 2 of the most successful animated movies of their year is outstanding. It's really something that very few people have done before. Miyazaki was a visionary, and he was making a change. This is a good point to look back and see that his past experiences with early studios and projects completely shaped his career. Miyazaki's movies are a reflection of himself. They're a direct expression of his experiences and how he feels. But even this did not quench Miyazaki's thirst for progression. And the studio's next project would not be 1 film, but 2 films produced simultaneously. My Neighbor Totoro and Grave of Fireflies, a seemingly impossible task for the studio and one that could have easily destroyed what they had built. Miyazaki would direct Totoro and Takahata would direct Fireflies. Although these were vastly different movies, they would be worked on together, with animation staff switching between jobs and Miyazaki working closely with Takahata. Here we see Miyazaki's management skills flourish. There aren't many other places where such a large amount of work could be done in a fairly small environment. Their policy of not dropping quality was maintained, and they didn't have to dilute the production with too much outside help. Miyazaki was proving that he could maintain the environment for creation that he envisioned. The 2 films were somehow finished and released in 1988, both incredibly well received critically, and rightfully so. They're 2 of the most interesting and polished anime films of the decade. Totoro even went on to financially help the studio a few years later on with the surprise popularity of Totoro merchandise. 1988 was an achievement for Miyazaki. His hard work and vision had led him from directing his first movie to orchestrating 2 movies with his own studio in under a decade. He had helped set a new standard for Japanese animation along with a handful of other films in the late 80s, and this was only the beginning. As if 2 movies in 1988 weren't enough, Miyazaki took on the producer role of a 3rd movie that would be directed by Katsuya Kondo. It was Kiki's Delivery Service, a novel adaptation. But during production, Miyazaki became unhappy with the movie's direction and after the release of Totoro and Fireflies, took over position of director, rewriting the story and redesigning many aspects of the world. He took the movie in a completely different direction, and it was released as a feature film in 1989. It's hard to show just how well Kiki performed in the box office, but it surpassed Totoro and Fireflies combined, becoming the highest grossing Japanese film of the year, and it sent Studio Ghibli to a whole new level. This is where it all changed for Miyazaki and his studio. After Kiki, they could afford to fail and continue going. They had this huge amount of financial padding now, and a well-established name in Japan and across seas. A huge movement was happening in the West where thousands of movie fans were discovering Japanese animation, and there was a massive desire for the movies of this medium. Miyazaki was a name at the forefront of that wave. This set him up nicely to sail with ease into the new decade, a time where the economy was forcing other studios into a creative corner and destroying projects. Kiki made enough money for Ghibli to continue working as they had been without any worries. This was Miyazaki's opportunity to further stamp his influence into the medium. The 90s started off rather interestingly for Miyazaki. The studio seemed to develop a rotation of Miyazaki and Takahata for the director roles. 1991 seen Only Yesterday by Takahata, 92 seen Porco Rosso by Miyazaki, then Takahata's Pompoko in 1994 and Miyazaki's Whisper of the Heart in 1995. This was a period of stability for the studio. All these films were incredibly successful in the box office and managed to ease the studio's journey through a difficult time in the industry. I personally think that this period is rather overlooked in Miyazaki's career. There was less progression with production volume or box office numbers, but I genuinely believe that some of the studio's best work was done during this period. Whisper of the Heart, for instance, is one of Miyazaki's most interesting storylines, using a much more regular setting. And Only Yesterday is an amazing step into a narrative outside the studio's comfort zone. Miyazaki and Ghibli were still working endlessly to hone their craft, and that would pay off with their next project. Miyazaki was actually working on his next project years before its release, and would continue working on it years after as well. Princess Mononoke was a project very close to his heart and had colossal impact on anime. It's fair to say that Mononoke dwarfs everything the studio had done prior in terms of its success and impact. It made Ghibli a worldwide brand and cemented Miyazaki's place as one of the most important names in Japanese cinema. Princess Mononoke was an idea that Miyazaki had had for decades. It was a story that he had drawn his first ideas for in the 70s, and one that had been brewing in his head ever since. He instantly inserted his meticulous direction over the film. Narratively, this would be one of his most technical stories yet, and storytelling-wise, Mononoke can be seen as a perfection of the kind of narrative Miyazaki had been telling over the past 20 years. Themes of environmental issues and man's battle with nature, they're all present here and explored in great depth, all themes that had been touched on before in his previous films. And seeing the direction of his films after Mononoke, it's clear that he felt that it had finally addressed those themes as he would have liked, a kind of ultimate point for this curve in Miyazaki's career. One of the most important aspects to the film's production was the scale of the animation. The film contained 140,000 cells of animation. Miyazaki is rumoured to have individually supervised 80,000 of them. This, in a production sense, is insane, almost obsessive for Miyazaki, but it shows in the movie's unbelievable fluidity in its movement. This was the first time computer animation was used in a Miyazaki film. Computers were only just being introduced to Japanese animation in the 90s, and many were rather unfavourable. Works like Ghost in the Shell a few years prior had used them beautifully, but it wasn't an easy craft to master. Miyazaki utilised them not as a substitute for animators or as a branch of style, but as a tool for efficiency. Mononoke's production seemed never-ending, so computers were used in segments of the film to increase production speed. Miyazaki was one of the early adopters of computer animation in the industry, which is interesting considering his rather traditional attitude in many areas. The movie was released in 1997, production finishing only a few months prior. It was met with colossal success, becoming one of the highest grossing films of the year worldwide. Not bad for a film in the same year as Titanic. Mononoke has attained this legacy as the end of an era. It was one of the last movies before the industry was consumed completely by digital animation, and maybe a catalyst for that as well. For Miyazaki to have pushed the boundaries of traditional animation so far, it's understandable to see why the studio and the rest of the industry would want to move on. And it's true, Mononoke was the end of an era. Anime evolved, and Mononoke is a beautiful example of what it once was. Although a lot of the industry had been left behind, Miyazaki was still firmly on the front line and was ready to grasp the new digital age with both hands. And with the turn of the 20th century, production began on Spirited Away, Miyazaki's next film. At this point, the studio had gone completely digital. Ghibli had a full in-house CG team, and all their animation was done with digital ink on computers. Again, Miyazaki was careful not to let CG animation take over, and to keep the aesthetic of Ghibli as traditional as possible. They even animated an artificial movement in still frames to replicate cell animation. It was essential that all important production remained in-house as to not let quality slip. Another element of Miyazaki's production during this movie was that he started production before he had finished planning the movie. Each section of the movie was produced while it was being storyboarded. This puts a lot of strain on scheduling, but it lets the story develop naturally and help towards the film's dreamlike narrative. The film was released in 2001, just 18 months after production had begun, and it was a worldwide hit, not only surpassing Mononoke's box office, but becoming the highest grossing movie in Japan ever. It was also a massive hit overseas, and it was dubbed and released by Disney in the next again year. This is something I want to touch on as well. Miyazaki and his studio were becoming more than just a Japanese animation studio. They were becoming an international brand. Their likeness to classic Disney films made them extremely compatible with Western audiences, and the Ghibli library became known across the globe. This is an achievement that very few individual anime titles have achieved before, never mind a whole animation studio. But age was now catching up with Miyazaki. He couldn't work as efficiently as he wanted to anymore, and young talented directors were thirsty for work at his studio. Miyazaki had actually considered retirement after Mononoke, a reoccurring consideration for Miyazaki from here on out. Although the gaps between movies got larger and larger for Miyazaki, he kept getting drawn back, starting with Howl's Moving Castle in 2004, and then Ponyo 4 years later in 2008, and then finally The Wind Rises 5 years later in 2013. Of course, he took smaller jobs such as co-screenwriter on various projects, but it's clear Miyazaki's days as a production madman are over. And I'm not surprised. He spent the last 50 years of his life dedicating himself to animation, giving every ounce of his being to his work, making sure every inch of every movie was how it should be, building one of the most successful animation studios in history from the ground up, defying industry standards and changing the medium with every stroke of his pen. He's given his life to his movies, and he's done it purely for the love of creation. You can really see his influence in every single anime you watch today. It's hard to see how modern anime would be without Miyazaki's fantastical touch. We really owe a lot of what we love about the medium to the work done by Miyazaki and the rest of Studio Ghibli. And I hope this video has done a good enough job of highlighting that. I've got a lot of similar videos coming up in the future which I hope will shine more light on various aspects of the medium. So please do click the subscribe button and watch a couple of other videos. And if you enjoyed this one, please do share it around. It takes a lot of time and effort to make, and I would really appreciate it. But thank you very much for watching this video.